welcome you to our first annual conference, International Teacher Education Network Conference, or the ITEN 2022, on the topic of new paradigm in education in the post-COVID-19 era. Today, we have about 70 participants, experts, and professionals joining this conference. So thank everyone for bringing your expertise and experiences around the table and engaging in such fruitful, constructive, and open exchanges. ITEN 2022 aims to provide a platform for international educators and researchers to share their research results with the global academic community. Participants can take this opportunity to learn and advance their knowledge and practices in education. Like John Dewey once said, education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. Before we get started, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all of you who generously help us make our first conference come together to become a success. And it is about time that we would have our Dean to greet you. Please virtually welcome our Dean of Faculty of Education for an opening remark, Associate Professor ปัทมาวดี เล่มงคล
Dear keynote speakers, President of เกษตรศาสตร์ University, administrative team, fellow colleagues, and all, we are delighted to have you with us to participate and share in this special occasion, our first International Teachers Education Network Conference, New Paradigms in Education in the Post-COVID-19 Era. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are choosing to hold this conference virtually via Zoom this year. It's my privilege and on behalf of the Faculty of Education, เกษตรศาสตร์ University, to welcome you here today. This extraordinary condition generated by COVID-19 inevitably lead us to meet virtually. I believe that during these 2 days, we have all had insightful, interactive discussions and great chance to share the outcomes of our research. My special thanks to delegates from the U.S. Embassy, the President of เกษตรศาสตร์ University, our AsTEN cohorts, and other sponsors for their great support in making this conference possible. I wish all presenters and participants a fruitful conference. Also, my gratitude extends to our close friends and partners, the Association of Southeast Asian Teacher Education Network, or AsTEN, International Teacher Education Organization in Southeast Asia with 10 member nations. We would like to mark this very first milestone along with our friends from across the globe as we go along this COVID-19 pandemic. I am optimistic that our next new normal chapter would lead us to more balanced personal and professional lives. Hopefully, the pandemic would eventually subside and we will be able to meet in person next year. Thank you for joining our virtual conference.
Thank you so much. And now we are happy to welcome you back, our keynote speaker from collegial partners who have contributed greatly to this conference. Many of you may already know them by their books, book chapters, articles that widely published in the field. We have Professor Anthony Clark from the University of British Columbia, Canada, on the topic of new paradigm in teacher education. He will start at 9 to 10 a.m. Bangkok time today. Then we will come back with after lunch and enjoy an afternoon session with Professor John Williams from Curtin University, Australia. And tomorrow we will come back with Professor Mark Wilson and Gary John Professor. And we are pleased to have all 4 distinguished keynote speakers who are well known in the fields, and their expertise could surely address insightful ways to prepare for the next new chapter that is going to come right after the pandemic is finally over. I would assure you that you would gain knowledge and experiences from attending these keynote sessions. Apart from these speakers, we also have panel sessions that could surely spark your interest in the educational journey. Our panelists include Professor T. Cheng Chang from the Department of Education and Human Potentials Development from National Donghua University, Taiwan, Dr. Nino Naudoza, Director of Institute of Knowledge Management from the Philippines, Normal University, Philippines, Assistant Professor Udomlak Kunsirod from the Department of Education, เกษตรศาสตร์ University, Thailand, Associate Professor Teo Tang Wee, co-head at the Multi-Centric Education Research and Industry STEM Center at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. I'm trying my best to pronounce the names. I do apologize if any of the names were mispronounced. This is indeed the great pleasure for us to have you here on the ITEN 2022 conference. Our program is focused on 12 strands, which are mainly focused on education, pedagogy, teacher education, educational ecological system, and related areas for us to hear about and share good practices. I would encourage our participants to go extra mile and remain engaged and constructively contribute to this ongoing process to fully reap the benefits of all the efforts that went into this ambitious exercise. We have also welcomed oral participants from various countries who are not only our faculty members, but also graduate students and their cohorts. I am sure this will be a worthwhile effort, as we heard that many participants are eager to attend. To commemorate our very first virtual ITEN 2022, I would like to invite Dr. Jongrak Vacharindrat, the president of เกษตรศาสตร์ University, to deliver an opening welcome speech and officially welcome all of you. Let's give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Jongrak Vacharindrat. กราบเรียนเชิญค่ะ
Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure to join all of you today during the opening ceremonies of the International Teacher Education Network Conference. New paradigm in education in the post-COVID-19 era, presented by the Faculty of Education of เกษตรศาสตร์ University. I extend my warmest welcome to all of you, especially the visitors who are joining from abroad. The International Teacher Education Network Conference, ITEN, provide the opportunity for educational professionals and practitioners to come together and extend view about the need, challenge, and trend in education. The theme this year is New Paradigm in Education in the Post-COVID-19 Era. I'm pleased to know that quite a large number of educators and teachers are participating in the International Teacher Education Network Conference. I'm confident it will be a valuable opportunity for your professional development. I hope that the knowledge gained from the conference will help teachers keep pace with the largest trend in education, to motivate them to prepare for coming challenges. Tomorrow, learning is being showcased today. The foundation of the concept in the recognition that we all have the potential to become change agents, to offer our creativities and to pursue innovation as we move into the future. The key to societal growth is the well-educated society will have quality education made valuable at every level of society. I believe that the presentations, the discussions, and the collision context you made during the conference with people who have shared common goal will be beneficial to you. Thank you for attention and best wish for the successful conference. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you, Ka. Thank you so much. Indeed, as our president mentioned, the key to societal growth is a well-educated society with high-quality education made available at every level of society. We could not agree more. Now, before we begin our next session, I would like to make a brief announcement. Let me share the screen for a little bit. To make progress, we are going to hear about e-learning, educational policy, and practices occasioned by COVID-19. We are looking forward to the findings of the latest trends, which you will hear about later, because our first keynote speaker is so keen to the field, which could potentially provide ways for us to keep up with changing needs and challenges. Today, we will hear from two keynote speakers, beginning with Professor Anthony Clark and Professor John Williams. Let's start with our first keynote speaker, Professor Anthony Clark.
Thank you very much. And
actually, can I briefly introduce you? Sorry.
Okay.
I was turning on this one. So, sorry. Let's start with our first keynote speaker, Professor Anthony Clark. He is a well-known professor from the University of British Columbia, Canada. For many years, he has been a very good friend of our faculty. We are so thankful for his share on new paradigms in teacher education. He did not hesitate one bit to accept the invitation to be our keynote speaker, so very thankful. Dr. Anthony Clark spent 12 years as a high school teacher in Australia before moving to Canada to work at the University of British Columbia. He currently teaches both undergraduate and graduate students, primarily in the areas of qualitative research methods, teacher inquiry, and schooling in comparative perspective. He also works with the faculty members from across the campus in the SOTL Informed Faculty Certificate Program. His current research exploring the practicum in teacher education with a focus on the professional development of mentor teachers. We strongly encourage all participants from all segments to share your experiences. Please do not hesitate to send your questions in either Thai or English to the chat box, and we will have a team to conclude and translate, if any, and present all the questions for you. Let's give a virtual round of applause for Professor Clark with his topic, New Paradigms in Teacher Education. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate all the work that you've done at the conference. This is so beautifully organized and such a welcoming atmosphere that I really do appreciate the opportunity to visit virtually your university, one which I've been at and have enjoyed your hospitality in the past. And I hope in the future we can do it again face to face. But for today, we've got this virtual environment, which we've spent some time getting used to over the last couple of years. And what I'd like to do is actually use my PowerPoint presentation because I'm a visual learner and I like to learn through images, which you will see. So hopefully you can sit back and relax for about the next 35 minutes as I walk through some of the things I'd like to share with you based on my experience over the last couple of years. So I'm just going to go to share screen. And hopefully that's come up and everyone can see the screen. I'm getting a nod there, so that's a good sign. Okay, my talk today is about new paradigms in teacher education. There are a number of fields: mathematics education, science education, English education, but I'm going to focus today on teacher education. And as I do that, I want to thank you for inviting me, ITEN 2022, to this conference, and also to kษาศาสตร for warmly welcoming me and allowing me to make this presentation. Hopefully, when I share my PowerPoint slides, you can select the standard view at one side and you'll be able to see the full screen and all the images on the screen. My talk today, whoops, just one moment. My talk today is made up of 6 parts. I'm going to talk briefly about pre-COVID, COVID, and post-COVID, whenever we get there. I'm going to then speak about paradigms and paradigm shifts. I'm then going to share a true story with you. Then look briefly at the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. I'll then move to a commentary about complexity and emergence, and then have a final word. I realise that many of these things are just a reminder about things we already know, and really are a review of some of the taken for granted assumptions we already have about teacher education. But hopefully in the presentation today, there will be a suggestion or two for thinking differently about teacher education today, having gone through the COVID period. Let's go to the first part of the presentation, pre-COVID, COVID, and post-COVID. Well, I'm sure in Bangkok and elsewhere in the world, this is what it looked like pre-COVID. The students lived at home and they came to the university. The teachers lived in their home and they came to the university and they studied together at the university. And then suddenly COVID arrived, and this relationship, this network that we had between students, teachers, and universities was fractured, and you've all experienced this. We suddenly found ourselves, teachers and students, visiting each other's home and no longer the university through Zoom or Google Meet or whatever the platform that you used for your teacher education programs. And I think maybe post-COVID, and certainly this is the case at our institution, we have maintained some online activities that we created during COVID, and we've started coming back to the university now for face-to-face. So we have this new network that sort of has developed as a result of COVID. What I'd like to do is to share with you some of the comments from our instructors as a result of COVID and working online. One of them said, the students knew more about technology, so it was a good opportunity for distributed leadership, which is an interesting point. Another one said, one student didn't turn his camera on for the whole class, so I never knew what he looked like. Another, I couldn't read the physical cues in the Zoom classroom, so it was hard to know how to respond individually to the students. Another person, I was surprised to see students who never spoke in a face-to-face classroom suddenly find their voice in the Zoom breakout rooms. And the last one, it was great to see students helping each other using the chat feature during class. So what we have here is a range of comments that I'm sure are very familiar to you, but underlie this interesting shift pre-COVID, COVID, and as we move into post-COVID. What I'd like to do now is to talk about two concepts, thrive, survive, nosedive, and native, visitor, and alien. What we found during COVID, and I'm sure this is your experience too, some students and some instructors thrived. They loved that environment and they took off and they reached new heights. Maybe for some of us, we just survived. We managed to cope. We learned new things. We were able to go online. We created a new office space or learning space at home to do the things that we ordinarily did at university. But there were some of us who nosedived. We crashed and flamed out. It wasn't a success for us. We weren't ready for it. The learning curve was too steep and we were unable to cope. Now, thrive, survive, and nosedive is closely related to native, visitors, and aliens, which I'm sure you've heard of before. If we think of the population of instructors, those who were regular users of online technologies already, the natives, there was a small group of us and they thrived. They were very used to this environment. Then there were the visitors to online technologies. They had been familiar with and were occasional users of online technologies. And that sector did okay. They certainly survived, and some of them moved into the thrive category as a result of the COVID situation. But then certainly at our university, and I don't know if this was the case at your university, there were the aliens those who were largely non-users of online technologies. So this was a very alien environment for them. And as you can see from the big light blue sector on the diagram, in my experience, this was a greater number of instructors on campus that had to suddenly make this shift. And what was one of the major impacts of COVID, if nothing else? I think it exposed a very big gap in our teachers' digital instructional literacy. And I know the next keynote speaker will speak more to this issue. But this is one of the major impacts that it had at our university. So it was very much a stretch for many of us to cope with the online environment. Now I'd like to move to the second part of my presentation and talk a little bit about paradigms and the concept of paradigm shifts. Again, I apologize if you already know this and you're familiar with it, but I think it is a useful reminder and sets the scene for the conversation that will follow. Paradigms and paradigm shifts. It really raises the question, and that's what this conference is about. Did the pandemic prompt a paradigm shift in teacher education? Or was it just a modality shift? Did we just change modes of teaching? We went to face-to-face to online, and it might not have been a paradigm shift for some of us. But it does also raise the question, what is a paradigm? And if you'll bear with me, I'd like to spend a few seconds just thinking about paradigms. I often, when I talk about paradigms, I use these images. For example, I'd ask folks, what do you see here? And as you look at this diagram, I wonder what you see. I know that some people would say, I see a duck. But for other people, they might say, I see a rabbit. So a paradigm is a way of seeing the world and making sense of the world. What about this image? What do you see here? I expect some of you will say, I see 4 rods. But if you're looking at the world from a different perspective, you might say, I see 3 rods. These are very simple illustrations of how we might think about a paradigm. I think a paradigm is a way of making sense of phenomena in the world, hence it's a world view that we use. Paradigm is a set of well-established beliefs and practices about the world. And a paradigm determines how we think about and explore that world. So I think in teacher education, the paradigm that we draw upon in teaching or in teacher education is based on our assumptions about how people learn. So in teacher education, that's the phenomenon we think about, and it will direct and guide all the things that we do in teacher education, the notion of how people learn. And I'm going to come back to that repeatedly throughout the presentation. First, though, we probably should think about some of the assumptions we have about how people learn. And I'm going to share with you some of my assumptions so you can understand the logic of my presentation. Just out of curiosity, I thought I would go to Google and just see what their first page of images was on how people learn. And this is what I found. And I thought this was quite interesting because buried in here are a number of assumptions about how people learn. For example, what do you see here? Here's the notion that we can fill empty heads with knowledge. These ones are interesting. These are people interacting with each other, which tells us something else about assumptions about how people learn. And this set focuses very much on books, suggesting that book knowledge is important for how people learn. And we could go on and explore, we could do a whole session just on the images that you can find on Google. But for the sake of moving on, I'd like to suggest there are 7 points that I use as assumptions for thinking about the paradigm in teacher education. The first one, we will never know with certainty how people learn. As researchers, we can watch them, we can observe them, we can ask questions. We will never know with certainty how they actually learn. And that's why we are always hypothesizing about how people learn. We have a whole lot of theories. And as a result of our hypothesizing, various theories are put forward for about how people learn. And when there is widespread agreement about a particular theory for how people learn, then it becomes the dominant paradigm in that age or in that era for how people learn. Dominant paradigms, I think, can last between 25 to 200 years. Once they're established, they can become quite permanent. And only when there is widespread agreement about a new theory for how people learn does that new theory replace the existing paradigm. And I've underlined the word widespread agreement because that will become important in our conversations as we go forward. And finally, when this happens, i.e. there's widespread agreement about a new theory, we say there has been a paradigm shift in how people learn. So I think that's what we're looking at in the conference this year at ITEN, the notion of a paradigm shift in the various areas that we're going to talk about. Is there widespread agreement about that shift? I'd like to say one more thing about paradigm shifts, and it has to do with the glacial pace of innovation. In general, when there's a dominant paradigm, everybody is on the one path and they're all moving in one direction. And that's the dominant paradigm. But occasionally there are innovators who propose new theories about how people learn, i.e. potential new paradigms. And if they start to be noticed, we find that the ideas about the new paradigm follow this curve, I think, suggested by Rogers. And Rogers suggests that in the early days, there are innovators who are working with a new way of thinking about how people learn. And if it's reasonably successful and it starts to appear at conferences in books, we get another group of people joining the innovators, the early adopters, and they get excited and start trying out that theory for how people learn. And then it might become so popular that we have almost 50% of the population in teacher education, for example, drawing on that theory as their paradigm for how people learn. But I don't think it's until we have another big group of people, the late majority, joining all those other people, that we might say there's been a paradigm shift. That is, widespread agreement about this theory about how people learn. So I think that's useful to think about as we go forward. But there's certainly the lesson that we learn from this is that paradigm shifts, one, they don't happen very often, and two, when they do happen, they do not happen quickly. And that's an interesting point when we think about the last 2 years of COVID and whether there was a paradigm shift or not. I'd like to move on now to a true story, and this is my story. I lived through a paradigm shift, and it wasn't a very comfortable experience. So in 1973 to 1976, when I was just a little baby, I went to Melbourne University and got my teacher education degree. And during that time, I was taught about the transmissive approach to how people learn. And I spent 4 years learning all the tricks that I needed to use for the transmissive approach. And we know that a transmissive approach assumes that learners are blank slates in general. Then in 1977 to 1987, I became a teacher at East Doncaster Secondary College. And all through that time, the dominant paradigm that I used in my teaching was a transmissive approach. And I can show you some of my lesson plans and some of the booklets that I created and show you exactly how I thought you taught. For example, you break things down into little pieces, you teach the little pieces, and then you get the students to repeat to you all those little pieces, and then you know that they have learnt something. And it did work. Not a lot of people complained. The parents were happy. The principal was happy. I was happy. I taught mathematics, computer science, and physical education using this method. Then in 1987, towards the end of 1987, I went to the University of British Columbia, UBC, to do a master's degree. And when I got there, my whole life got turned upside down. This was a time period, and you're probably very familiar, where a new paradigm was starting to take over in teaching and teacher education. And that paradigm was the constructivist approach. And I was a resistor because I taught and learned very successfully for 14 years how to use the transmissive approach. And I have to admit, I wasn't totally convinced in the first year or two that this new thing called constructivism was really a very successful way to think about teaching and learning. But after sitting in lectures and reading books and visiting various universities, I became convinced that this was a better way to think about teaching and learning, where we assume that learners enter the classroom with conceptions which serve as the starting point for constructing new knowledge. So I adopted that approach, and between 1990 and 2005, I taught and planned and arranged my programs using a constructivist approach. I haven't abandoned that totally, by the way, but something happened after 2005 that slightly changed my thinking about teaching and learning. But I just wanted to share with you that sense of living through a paradigm shift and how long it can take and how uncomfortable it can be. Let's go on to the fourth part. And I think unless we know the history of paradigm shifts in education or teacher education, we can't really understand where we are at the moment. So when I accepted this invitation, when Chatri wrote to me and said, would I do this keynote address, I said yes. And I thought at that time that I could just go to the library and find out the history, and then I'd be able to present that to you today. Seemed like a very straightforward task. So I went to the library, both physical and digital, and I searched in the library for the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. And much to my horror, I found when I got there that the shelves were empty. I couldn't find, and maybe you have, and you can tell me, but I certainly couldn't find anyone who'd really written about the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. I did find people who had written about the paradigm shift from transmissive to constructivism. There are a lot of people wrote about that singular shift. I did find people making an argument that there was a paradigm shift to feminism or to critical theory or to postmodernism, but they were usually in very localized settings. For example, Ken Zeichner in America ran his whole program on critical theory, but they were localized. I don't think there was widespread agreement across countries and institutions that critical theory was the way to conduct a teacher education program. Anyway, so what I found I had to do was to build my own understanding of the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. And this won't come as a big surprise to you, many of the things that I'm going to share. But I think there are at least 6 dimensions that we have to consider if we're thinking of the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. And as I say, if you've found the book on them, please send it to me. I'd very much like to compare it with what I've come up with today. Those 6 dimensions are as follows: the era or the age that's associated with that paradigm, the paradigm itself, the instructional focus that was taken during that paradigm, the characteristics of the paradigm, what was its impact on education in general, and what was its impact on teacher education. So if you bear with me for the next few minutes, I'd like to walk through each of these 6 dimensions in my construction of the history of paradigm shifts in teacher education. And this is all open to interpretation and challenge, so I fully understand that, but this is the way I've tried to make sense of it for today's conversation. Let's begin with the first one. Well, there was a very early age called the agrarian age or the agricultural age, and I think that ran through up until the 1760s. That was followed by what we call the industrial age, and that went for quite a long period of time. And some people even say that continues today, and they call the current age that we're in the 4th industrial age. And they have markers along the way for the 2nd and the 3rd industrial age. But I think in following this industrial age was the information age between 1970 and 2005. And what's the current age called? Well, from my reading, I think probably one of the better terms is called the network age. You might have a better name, but if you'll allow me to use that today as we talk about paradigm shifts. Let's go to the 2nd dimension. What's the dominant paradigm in each of these ages? Well, in the early days, I think it was experiential. And you can see from this diagram, people working and learning on the job through the experience. What about the industrial age? I think this is an age where it included behaviorism, but it was largely labelled transmission. And this is where we thought we could pour knowledge into people's heads. The next age, I think the information age, is actually characterised largely by constructivism, starting with cognitivism in the 1950s. And there were variants of constructivism, social constructivism, for example. But that's what this age, that was the paradigm for this age. What about the networked age? Well, this is an interesting one, because this is the question you're asking at ITEN. And as you know, I'm a visual learner, and the best representation of this age, visual representation, I think, is this particular moving diagram. And we'll talk about why I think that's a good representation of the current age. When I tried to find what might be the underlying theory for this age, the networked age, I found a number of theories, and I'm sure there are more, but I just didn't find them all. But Bruno Latour had a theory called actor network theory, which might apply. Manuel Castell has space of flows theory. George Siemens talked about connectivism theory, and that was quite popular. And a number of people have taken that up to try and describe today. Philippa Levy talked about living theory in 2006. Brent Davis refers to the theory of emergence or complexity in 2006. Wanda Orlikowski talks about socio-materialism. And that's also been taken up by a number of people. But then I found another article by Chris Jones in 2016. Sorry about the 2007, I don't know why that's there. But in 2016, Chris Jones wrote quite a long article saying there is no theory for this networked age. And you can read that and find out more about that. But I'm going to choose this one, the theory of emergence based on complexity. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next phase of the talk. So let's just have a look at the next dimension. Oh, before I do, you'll notice there's a little lag time, and I'll put that there deliberately between the age when it starts and where there's widespread agreement about a particular paradigm. So that's why there's that little slippage. You'll also note I've got emergence in a dotted line, suggesting that this is provisional. And I'm not saying this is the definite one for this age. And in this conference, you'll talk about other ones, I'm sure. What's the instructional focus for each of these ages? Well, I think during the agrarian age, it was very much focused on the family. Industrial age was teacher focused. The teacher was the important thing. Information age and in constructivism, we suddenly had the student becoming the focus of instruction. I don't know, but I'm going to put this one up for you, and you've heard of it before, I'm sure. We might call this learning focused age. And again, I'm happy if you want to suggest another title. Let's go on to the next dimension. This will take a little bit longer because we want to look at the characteristics of the ages so we can appreciate where we are today. I'm just going to move that up a little bit, and underneath that I'll work through these. In the agrarian age, people worked in service of their families' needs. They were labourers on farms, in fields, or worked on home crafts. Learning was based on what works and was through observation and of the job. That's a characteristic. What about the next age, the industrial age? This period represents a shift to a society dominated by factories and machines. And for example, children found themselves removed from their homes and from parental supervision, and they were initially placed in factories as cheap labour, which involved largely repetitive tasks. Now, I know that changed over time, but that's the characterisation I have in the early part of this age, and we'll talk more about that as we move down through the dimensions. In the information age, we saw a shift from traditional industry to an economy based on information technology. And this age was dependent on the development of the transistor in 1947. This is an age during which technology enabled people to readily access information, for example, using the World Wide Web. What does it look like today? Well, I think that learning in the networked age involves complex entanglements of peers, teachers, ideas, activities, tools, places, and spaces. Learners use tools such as the web not only to access content, but also to create new content through individual and collective engagement. And importantly, learning is open-ended, non-linear, self-organizing, adaptive, and emergent. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as I go on to the complexity component of this talk. Moving on now, let's look at the next dimension. What impact did these ages have on education? Well, during the agrarian age, learning was really done at the elbow of the experienced worker. This was an earlier form of apprenticeship. In the industrial age, schools were created by the state, schools as we know them today, to provide for an increasing need in factories for an obedient, compliant, rule-following workforce. The development of these schools represented the institutionalization of learning. So learning was now in an institution. Not surprising, learning was regimented, impersonal, standardized, and largely through memorization or rote learning. The teacher was the holder of the knowledge and the students were the empty vessels. What about the information age? Well, cognitivists and the constructivists who followed rejected behaviorism because behaviorists thought that learning was simply a reaction to an external stimulus. And by contrast, the cognitivists and the constructivists viewed learning as an internal mental process. And by the 1980s, the earlier research of Dewey and Vygotsky had blended with Piaget's work to become the broad approach to constructivism that we now attribute to Rosalind Driver, a professor from Leeds University, who was really the person who coined the notion of constructivism. And in the next age? Well, during the networked age, learning has moved, as you know, well beyond the four walls of the classroom. Networked learning is relational in that it involves an evolving set of connections between learners and resources leading to emergent outcomes that may not be exactly predicted in advance. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Well, nearly finished. We've got our last one now. What about the impact on teacher education in each of these ages? Well, schools as we know them today were non-existent, and therefore there was no teacher education in the agrarian age. Interestingly, in the industrial age, the introduction of schools for children was followed by the introduction of normal schools for teachers. The knowledge base for teacher education in normal schools was largely practice-driven. But towards the end of this period, education began searching for a more theoretical base and drew heavily on the field of psychology. The information age saw a shift in teacher education from what we called normal schools to these places called universities and colleges. And the knowledge base for teacher education became less practice-driven and more theory-based, in line with conceptions of universities and colleges. In the 1990s saw the adoption of constructivist-based models across the professions, including teacher education. And for example, reflective practice became a very widespread and accepted way of thinking about preparing teachers. And in the networked age? Well, that's a good question. What does the networked age mean for teacher education? Well, I'm looking forward to ITEN 22 and their answers to that question. I'm going to suggest that teacher education is imbued with a complexity sensibility. And I know I've asked you to be patient, and I'm coming on to what that might mean in the next part of the talk. So there we go. There are the 6 dimensions, and that's my brief history of paradigms in teacher education. And I'm open to challenge and objection if you think some of this is incorrect, or I've left some things out that are very important. Let's go now on to the thing that I've been promising you, is the notion of complexity and emergence. I need to start this by talking about a gentleman called Warren Weaver, who in 1948 said there are various types of phenomena. And he suggested one was called simple phenomena. It's like a game of billiards. There are very few variables, and simple phenomena allow exact predictions in advance of individual events. So we could tell you every possible combination that would come out of this simple phenomenon. Then he suggested there's a thing called complicated phenomena. And he used, well, I use the car industry as an example of complicated phenomena. What are they? There's many variables. It's difficult to predict every single outcome exactly, but complicated phenomena display a consistency that allows general predictions in advance of individual events. So, for example, I don't know how many, or we don't know who's going to have a car accident in Bangkok today, an individual event, but the car insurance industry knows pretty accurately how many car accidents there will be in Bangkok today. They know pretty accurately how many car accidents there will be in Bangkok this week or this year. So they might not know the individual events, but there's a consistency across the phenomena that allows something like the car industry to be hugely successful as a business. That would be an example of a complicated phenomenon. Now, Warren Weaver suggested there was another set of phenomena that neither of the other two accurately describe, and he called these complex phenomena. These phenomena have many variables. The outcomes are rarely consistent, making it difficult to make predictions with any certainty. However, when the outcomes do emerge, they are not random, but they display a uniquely patterned response. And here's an example of complex phenomena. And I'm sure you've all seen this. These are birds in flight, and they change direction, and they don't crash into each other, and we're not quite sure what's going to emerge, but surely enough, there is a patterned response that allows order within this phenomenon. Again, many variables, the outcomes are rarely consistent, making it difficult to make predictions with any certainty. However, when the outcomes do emerge, they are not random, but display a uniquely patterned response. So the birds don't crash into each other. Okay. So that's how Warren Weaver and people following him talked about complex phenomena. And the question I have today is learning a complex phenomena? Is what's happening in the networked age really captured by the notion of a complex phenomena? And maybe learning always was a complex phenomena, and it's only more obvious to us today that that is the case. Complex phenomena are said to have self-organizing properties, meaning that they are not centrally governed or controlled. Instead, individual agents within the system act with a degree of autonomy, leading to collective decision-making. These patterns of coherent aggregate behavior lead to a higher order of knowing, understanding, or action that might not have been originally anticipated, planned, or imagined at the outset. This is referred to as emergence. And that's why I like this little diagram, because when I think of emergence in my classroom, I think of learning as this diagram representing the sort of learning that takes place. There's a patterned response, things connect, things change, and things develop. What are some of the key characteristics of emergent phenomena if you think about your classroom? Well, it suggests that learning is non-linear. Learning is self-organizing. Complex phenomena are distributed, nested. They are in a state of disequilibrium. There are extensive feedback loops. This next one's important. There are a lot of neighborhood interactions. And I'll read this one. Agents, i.e. ideas and people, need to bump up against each other because the intelligence of the group is always greater than the intelligence of the individual. And the last two characteristics of complex phenomena, they're dynamic and they're adaptive. So the question we have to ask ourselves, are these characteristics that we are now recognizing in learning environments in a networked age? And I just put it to you that it may be possible that some of these describe what we've seen during COVID. For those interested in complexity in teacher education, I can recommend these four texts and articles. One by Johnson, very early one, the first one that I read. Then Brent Davis does a beautiful piece, Complexity in Education. Deborah Osberg, a lovely article and just a wonderful writer. And then Jones has a book on networked learning where he talks about an education paradigm in the age of digital networks. Recently, Martin and her colleagues wrote a piece in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education called Complexity Theory and Teacher Education. And that was in 2019. So we see more and more people referring to complexity and education and complexity and teacher education. What does it look like in a teacher education program? Here's my vision. Teacher education programs often look like this. The students are in the middle, and then the components of the program, or it might be a course, the components of the course encircle them. And the components of the course or the program always ask questions of the student teachers. I think, and I suspect that you're doing this already in many parts of your program, I think we need to open up parts of our program and turn that piece around. And when you turn that around, so the questions are not always being directed at the students, but they get to ask some of the questions, then there's the possibility for emergence of things that you might not have anticipated, things that roughly are in the direction that you want to go, but actually provide for the emergence of exciting possibilities for learning. And once you start thinking in that direction, you'll find, I think, that emergence starts happening in other parts of your program. And that's why I said before, you might start recognizing this phenomena as emergence when you start to be more attentive to the features of complexity. What does it look like in my course outline? Well, here's a course that I taught recently at my university. And I don't talk directly about complexity, but here's a key paragraph in my course outline, and I use it to suggest the image of emergence. And it comes from Gadamer, and I love this quote. He says, "The more genuine a conversation is, the less its conduct lies within the will of either partner. Thus, a genuine conversation is never the one that we wanted to conduct. Rather, it is generally more correct to say that we fall into conversation, or even that we become involved in it. The way one word follows another, with the conversation taking its twists and reaching its own conclusion, may well be conducted in some way, but the partners conversing are far less the leaders of it than the led. No one knows in advance what will come out of a conversation." So you can see the parallel here between the notions of emergence and the notions of a genuine conversation. And this is how I try to present my class to the students and how we try to work through the 13 weeks together during the course. And now I'm on to the last part, and that's good news because you'll be able to go off and have a coffee soon. The final word is in two parts. Did the pandemic prompt a paradigm shift in teacher education, or was it just a modality shift? I suggest that a paradigm shift was possibly well underway before COVID. And what COVID did was to accelerate that shift, and hence we have the theme of this conference. I suggest that a possible theoretical perspective underlying that shift is emergence, and you don't have to agree with me, I'm just putting it out there. And I might be wrong, and it might be something else, but as the curve of innovation suggests, only time will be able to tell. And there might be a totally different way of imagining what the paradigm shift is. But importantly, ITEN 2022 is exactly the right time and place to explore these possibilities. So I congratulate you in that regard. And as I finish this presentation, I'd like to suggest that complexity is about an evolving set of connections between learners and resources, leading to emergent outcomes that may not be exactly predicted in advance. It's not this, it's not this, it's not this, but I think it looks something like this. And you'll forgive me again because I do love my visual images. This is what I have in my mind as I walk into the classroom. An evolving set of connections between learners and resources, leading to emergent outcomes. And as the final word, I'd like to use a very short quote from possibly one of the earliest innovators of emergence, a gentleman called Jeffrey Bloom. And I think when he said this in the day, we probably all thought he was crazy, but I think it has an element of truth in it. And I'd like to share this with you. And if you take nothing else away from the presentation, maybe you'll remember this quote: "Invite chaos, trust complexity." I thank you very much for your attention and appreciate the opportunity to share these ideas with you.
Thank you so much. And now we have a question and answer session. If you have any question you would like to ask Professor Clark, you could send your sticker, your reaction with the raised hand so we could put a spotlight and unmute your microphone. Or you can send your question to the chat box and I could translate or read your question for you. Seems like we do not have any questions. Should I give more time?
Perhaps my invitation to have coffee was too tempting.
Maybe.
and it's early in the day.
From the chat box, a lot of thank you notes.
Yeah,
And
you're very kind.
I love the idea of this new paradigm being called emergence. It helps a lot in defining what is happening or should happen, both in education and teacher education. From Kun Kruk, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I could read this name correctly. Krupskaya Anonable, sorry. One asked, can we have a copy of your presentation? Thank you. Have that.
Yes, I can share the presentation. As I read through it again, I'm never satisfied with my presentation, so always the little changes. But I'm happy to share the current version with the conference, and they can.
That's so grateful. Thank you very much for inciting keynote. Complexity was complex and difficult. Does this mean that we learn and meet in a constructivist way? This is a question from Professor Maki Takayoshi.
It's a very good question. And I think I haven't abandoned constructivism, by the way. I still believe that that was a very insightful way of thinking about how people learn. And again, remember at the outset, I said we won't know with certainty, but we have theories. And it just so happened when in 2005, I took a one-year sabbatical and I took away a whole lot of books on complexity. And why I did that, I had a doctoral student in the previous year who just finished, and he'd used complexity to analyze the interaction of young children in an elementary school classroom. And I thought, it seems like a good idea. So I spent 1 year reading all that I could on complexity. And by the end of that year, I thought, I think that is a good language for talking about the way I teach. And so that was the gradual shift beyond 2005. But the questions, I haven't abandoned many of those ideas that I had from constructivism or constructionism in some senses, because they're still useful ideas and they're good theories. And so, yes, I use them in conjunction with each other. But if you ask me what I do in my classroom, I rely on serendipity, which is a big word, but it means I allow for emergence. I take risks. I don't have chaos in my classroom, although you might come in and wonder what are we doing sometimes, but I have to have that space where an idea or a direction is taken by the students. And this is why I think COVID was interesting. There was many more ways for this networking of ideas to happen that is not always possible in the face-to-face environment. I hope that answered a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And we will go to the next comment. Thank you so much, sir. I love the word invite chaos, trust complexity from Ria Sibian.
I will down this page. Tada, peach, August.
Is that a question or comment or something? Because of the noise, I could not recognize what the question is.
They probably said I had a nice shirt on.
Oh, very positive. Then we have another comment from Maria. Very informative session. Thanks, Professor. From Nauman C. Singstone, what is the best paradigm in this era that you think match with pandemic?
Well, as I tried to read up on as many as I could in preparation for today, and I listed those on the slide. I think each of you perhaps need to have a look at a summary of those. I tried to bring them together myself and chose emergence. But that's something that resonated with me. You might find that actor network theory or socio-materialism resonates more strongly with you. I still don't know how long it will take for widespread agreement on one particular paradigm.
All right. Next question from your Chatri Phaikamta. Professor Tony, based on perspective on complexity and emergence, what does teacher education program look like?
Well, I haven't seen a program yet that's entirely based on emergence. I think people are experimenting like I do in my course, and I run a small cohort of 36 student teachers at my university, and I use that as a research cohort to learn about what happens when we try to think about emergence. So, for example, in my course that I run, the inquiry is a very strong part. So I think complexity has a lot to do with inquiry. And during the COVID pandemic, because we weren't meeting face-to-face with students, and they weren't all in the classroom, but they were distributed, and then we used many more group-based activities, we had to rely on them using resources in their own settings, which was another way of allowing for emergence to happen because I didn't have control over those things. So I think a teacher education program starts to have less control over the emergent outcomes, but we have a general idea where we're going. Having said that, universities are very conservative places. So I don't break all the rules at the one time because I know my dean will ask me questions about assessment and I've still got to put marks in, etc. So there are still boundaries, but within those boundaries, I've found ways of being flexible.
Okay. Well, I have a lot of questions in the chat box and I'm going to read until we have reached the final time.
Right.
One we saw question is, how about the paradigm shift of school leaders education? Is it similar to the one for teachers?
That's a very good question. I would have to think a little bit more about that. I have a little bit of sympathy for school leaders, whether they're principals and administrators in schools or at the university setting, they're associate deans or deans of teacher education, because there's two things at play here. I call it the system of schooling on one hand and the educative agenda on the other hand. And these two things are always in tension and in balance. If the system of schooling, i.e. having to have marks, having to have transcripts, having to have exams, having to place instructors in front of classrooms, having to allocate students to classrooms, that's all the system. If that gets so big and controlling that the education agenda gets so small and disappears, then we're in trouble. So what I ask of the administrators and leaders, could they think about keeping the system and the education agenda in balance? Now, the education agenda can't get totally out of control, otherwise it would be chaotic and we wouldn't have any control. So if you ask me, what does complexity look like from a leadership perspective? It's allowing the appreciation between the tension between system of schooling and the educative agenda.
Great. We have another one from Pat Bagui. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce this. Thank you very much, Professor Clark, for the comprehensive presentation. Now is the question. Can learning focused be tagged outcomes focused?
Could you say the last part again for me?
Can learning focused be tagged, TAGGED, outcomes focused?
I can see where you're going with that. I worry a little bit that outcome focused might move back towards the notions of technical rationality that preceded constructivism if we just focus on the outcomes. I also worry that sometimes we saw teaching and learning as an information processing machine. Something goes in here and the outcome's out here. So I would be a little bit cautious about using outcomes focused for those two reasons. But I like the suggestion, and I wish we were face-to-face at the end of the session and we could sit down and have a cup of coffee, because I'm sure your ideas would help me understand how you're framing the outcomes focused. But thank you for the idea.
Great. Next, we have a question from Manila, PNU, from Jacob Olano. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to share an insight for the orientation of instruction of today's network age. I would suggest that it is relation-based I think that it is a nice progression from teacher to learner-based education, especially since multiculturalism and collaboration are emergent in contemporary education. What do you think?
I think you're spot on. I mean, that the notion of relations and relation-based is actually, and that's a nice idea too. And it's very possible. And I'm glad you suggested that, because that's what I was looking for. I was looking to provoke people to think about what might be some of the ways that you're thinking about it. And that's certainly a possibility, as with the last person who asked the question. Until we put these out on the table and examine them, and again, I wish I could have a cup of coffee with you in Bangkok to talk about that possibility. And that's very informative. Thank you.
All right. From answer for our, may I have a copy of your presentation? Yes, Professor, we provided, but he needed some time to polish it a little bit. And Tui Tong Nuan Morakot. Thank you very much, Professor Clark. My name is Nuan Morakot. I am a secondary school teacher who have been teaching online this whole year. My question is, my class lost inspiration a lot. How can I bring that inspiration back if we still have to further study online? Back to you.
Well, first of all, congratulations for surviving teaching online. And I mean, I taught classes, but I know my colleagues in schools how much more difficult it was. And part of it was about motivation and being able to read the physical cues in the classroom to actually respond. And I think the biggest difficulty of not being physically with your children is the proximity, and how just moving around the classroom, you communicate things to the students that we cannot do in a face-to-face environment. So some of those things, I think, are very difficult to replace. And maybe we need a blended environment where we do some online and some face-to-face. Your challenge is a very difficult one. For my own part, when I was teaching online, if you want to know, I was trying all possible things in the world to make the students curious about what I was going to do next. For example, in the background, I always put a different children's book, even though I was teaching graduate students. So every week when they tuned in, they were looking to see what book I had put up there. You can ask my wife. I went on the internet and bought a different t-shirt for every class when I was online, and it had to have the writing at the top of the t-shirt, so that was hard to find, and it had to be interesting, and I did them in some different languages. So the students wondered what I was going to wear and then asked me questions. And when I talk about emergence, this is a very possibility. I was getting students involved through curiosity. I mean, they're just two very simple examples about the classroom. And so for you, I missed one of the things was physically structuring the environment to enable learning, right? So even in my classes in graduate school, I get there a half an hour ahead of time and rearrange the desks because I'm looking for some particular result. So I missed that. So how do you do that in a two-dimensional tiled screen is very, very difficult. And so, I mean, again, it would be lovely to have a conversation with you and we could trade ideas about how you did that. Thank you for your question, though.
That is really tough. And now we have another comment from Paul Rowland. Thank Professor Clark. Very meaningful and informative session. And another one from Kuskaya. Sorry. One's comment is that while emergent is ideal for me, in parentheses, I think for the most part in the Philippines, COVID promoted a shift in modalities and not paradigms. Given the digital divide and other inequalities, it was not possible to really have substantial exchanges, especially among peers, in ideas that could lead to emergent insights and so on. That's just my take. I think that's not a question, it's just a comment maybe.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
I worried originally that the paradigm shift was against inequality. I think The shift to online created huge inequality with regard to access. And some of our students lived in challenging circumstances. So that's why they didn't turn their screens on, because they didn't, all they had was their bedroom. So I think the social justice piece of what's happened during COVID really is a very, very big challenge. And so I sympathise with you, and I know what that means. Just out of curiosity, I deliberately put into all my online classes a check-in session right at the very start, where I just say, what's happening in your setting and your lives that you'd like to share with the group. That here I was looking for emergence. I didn't know what was going to come out, but sometimes there were little threads that came through that allowed me and then allowed the class to get a little bit interested in some of the things that we were doing. So I sacrificed some of the curriculum time and put in the check-in. I called it check-in, and I had to wait a long time in the early days because people wouldn't say anything. I'd be sitting there looking at myself. But then eventually one person would say something, like, well, I got a range of comments. I mean, one day, one of my students in the graduate class said, I just met my boyfriend and we're going to get married. And I'd just like to share that with the class. And it was interesting. Suddenly there was a warmth. Suddenly people were saying congratulations. And I didn't expect that. And it changed the feeling in the class. So we got to know each other a little bit more. So, I mean, these are just simple, very simple ideas. And I know you're working in a very difficult environment. So I appreciate that.
More towards empathy and personal connection. Now we have the next one, Diosdado Contillo. What is the most important thing that the research gap would like to reveal?
I should have talked a longer time so you didn't ask such hard questions. I think the biggest thing, the research gap, well, I've been working on complexity and trying to do research on complexity for a while now. I don't think it's a very easy paradigm to think about how we might approach classrooms. I think one of the biggest difficulties, and that's why it took me 1 year to read about it, was to try and have a deep internal feeling about complexity and then explore and experiment. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I started to experiment and I got comfortable with being the level of impromptu activity in my class that I understood how I might begin to research it. And so some of those articles that I've suggested in the presentation really gave me a lot more confidence to move forward. So I think part of the gap is being confident in what you're doing, that you can take those risks, whether it's in teaching or whether it's in research. For example, I rewrote a research grant 3 or 4 times based on complexity before I convinced people that this might be an okay way to think about studying children in classrooms. Can I just use one more small example? Remember the transmission to constructivism? Well, in those days when I was writing my research papers to get published, we all had to pretty much put a little literature review on what constructivism was so the reviewers would understand. Well, 15 years later, you didn't have to do that. You just have to say constructivism and people understood and they accepted it. And then you moved on and you got on with your research or your teaching. Well, I'm finding that's a little bit like today. Every time I talk about constructivism, I have to put a little literature review so people understand what I'm talking about. But more and more people, I think, are understanding emergence. And I think the COVID environment has pushed people to think about, the previous speaker said, relational learning, connectedness, etc., which are all, I think, fundamental to constructivism, to complexity.
The more it becomes common to everyone.
Yes.
Now we have Calestic. We have right now 9:59, so we have 1 more minute. Okay. Otherwise, the rest of the questions, I think Professor Clark could directly answer in the chat box if you don't mind, or he could. We could all summarize all these questions and ask Professor Mark sorry, Professor Clark, and then post all the answers on the website. Thank you.
That would be good. If you could do that, that would give me time to think about them instead of trying to do them all often. Thank you very much, and I very much good luck for the rest of the conference. It's
please
great.
Don't go. Please don't leave for a coffee yet. I would like to officially answer. Thank you. Like you said, you wonder how people learn. Just like Benjamin Franklin once said, a quote, I quote, tell me, I quote him, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And a quote from you, complexity is about an evolving set of connections between learners and resources, leading to emergent outcomes that may not be exactly predicted in advance. Invite chaos, embrace it. During the presentation, we have about 172 attending this very conference. So quite a large number of attendants. So thank you. Your presentation was very impressive, very instructional indeed. And now let me highlight some points here. Prior to the pandemic, e-learning and e-learning assets were established. We have an emergence of complex phenomenon, which is dynamic and adaptive and state of disequilibrium. And post-COVID-19 and the closure of schools meant that this was no longer an option as teachers across the globe were struggle to embrace this digital shift. We are going to thrive, survive, and nosedive. Cause a complexity in a teacher education program as well. And these precedented upheaval of teaching and learning lasting 2 and almost a half years meant that the field of education and teacher education was challenged to re-examine existing assumptions and practices. And with deepest thanks to Professor Clark for your presentation and friendship for all of us, from all of us at Kachet Sath University. We cannot applaud you online, but somehow would like to ask everyone to show our appreciation. So can we send a thumbs up or emoji sticker to show our appreciation to Dr. Clark? And the screenshot already taken, the screenshot was already taken this morning. You guys could download from the Google Drive that we are going to send the link on the chat box, and also we'll post it on the official website of ITEN 2022 as well. And let me brief the agenda. We'll have a 10 minutes break, followed by the first parallel session starting at 10:10 a.m. to noon. And we have 4 rooms starting at 10 o'clock and 10 minutes sharp. There would be a separate Zoom links for each room. You would need to leave this main room and check into the Zoom link for parallel sessions, which is listed on the website. And once you are finished with your presentation, please come back to the main room for plenary session. We are standing by to assist you if you need any further assistance. So don't worry. Panelist session is awaiting you. We have Professor Dr. Jang, Department of Education and Human Potentials Development, National Donghua University from Taiwan, Dr. Nino Naldoza, Institute of Knowledge Management, Philippines, Normal University, Philippines, and Assistant Professor Udomlak Bunsiro, Department of Education, Kachet Sath University. And we have Associate Professor Dr. Teo Tang Wee, National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. And there will be a link that you could join. And if participants would like to attend any of these parallel sessions or share up your favorite presenters or be interested in any of the particular topics, please kindly do so as well. Go and share them up. You may need to join a parallel session for about 5 to 10 minutes prior. So while everyone is on the break, so you can have enough time to prepare for your presentation. Set up and check your connections and also the microphones. Each presenter will have approximately 10 to 15 minutes to present, and please spare 5 minutes for question and answer. But don't forget, we have another keynote speaker who is very, very interesting. This is one of the highlights of the point here. We have Professor John William of Curtin University as our second keynote speaker. Don't forget to come back. And on behalf of the conference team, I would like to say thank you for attending our opening ceremony and our keynote speaker. And I would like to end with a quote from Albert Einstein. Education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. Thank you and good luck. Peace be with you all. Again, you would need to leave this main room and check into the Zoom meeting. Link for parallel sessions, which is listed on the website. We look forward to welcoming you again after the break. Good luck. God bless you all. Bye. ขอบคุณและสวัสดีค่ะ